It is Sunday school once again, and I'm glad to see you. I always thought it was corny when people on television said, "Oh, it's good to see you today." And I always knew they're lying. They can't see me. I remember on Captain Kangaroo, uh, they had a character on Captain Kangaroo every morning called Grandfather Clock. And it was just a large grandfather clock with a grandfather clock's face, but it had eyes and a mouth that just went, and then that voice actor in the background said, "Good morning, Captain." And grandfather clock would always, after a little interaction with Captain Kangaroo or Mr. Green Jeans, right in the middle of a sentence, he would close his eyes and fall asleep. And go. But at the beginning of the conversation, Captain Kangaroo would always go up and Grandfather Clock would be asleep. Okay. And he says, "Oh, Grandfather Clock's asleep." He says, "Maybe we can wake them up, wake him up." And he says, "Okay, boys and girls, when I count to three, everyone say, 'Grandfather.'" And I thought, God, even as a little kid, I thought, he can't hear me. They're in New York. You know, it's just those kids. I'm not going to be fooled. Any kid that'd be fooled into doing that is just a moron. Well, once I did a sleepover at a friend's house, and we were watching Captain Kangaroo in the morning, drinking Bosco, and it came time to wake up Grandfather, and my friend said, "Grandfather." And I said, "Oh, you're so lame." I, I confess, I was a cynical little bastard. Okay, I really was. Can you imagine me at Sunday school, at real Sunday school? It's just, you've got to be joking, you know. Uh, All of them on a boat. Yeah, wouldn't the lion eat the giraffe? Come on, come on. But anyway, I digress. Yesterday, I was talking about a real live wonder-working wizard. His real name was Gary Rossignol. And he was, in my opinion, in his own way, a saint. As a matter of fact, he had a brother in Canada, Quebec or Toronto, who was a priest, and every time the priest would say mass, the church would light up, miraculously light up. And everybody noticed, gee, when Father Rossignol does mass, the church lights up. Well, they got back to the Vatican, and they investigated. And as a matter of fact, and I believe his brother eventually died, sort of at a young age. There was an investigation at foot to beatify or something. So he had a saint as a brother, a wonder-working saint as a brother. So I told you yesterday about we actually moved to Southern Oregon because we heard about this follower of Yogananda and a healer who was selling land, along the Illinois River there. And Constance and I, as I mentioned yesterday, for a while were privileged to live in a little cabin right behind their Gary and his wife Diane and their son Andre, who was about 10, I believe, at the time. Uh, and Andre, if you're listening, I know you're on Facebook and comment every once in a while. I want you to know how much I treasure the memory of you and your parents. But anyway, uh, I wanted to mention a story, an event that happened when Constance and I were living in the little cabin behind their barn temple home. Um, that in my mind actually qualified as one of those uh, miraculous things a wizard would do. Okay. Gary was a most unlikely wizard. He was a very modest, uh, soft-spoken man, uh, but he was a yogi and he was a mystic. And I don't know when he slept. He worked all night at a dairy and worked all day around the farmstead. But anyway, I read the first part of it. I tell the story in my life with the spirits. And there's very few wonder stories in my life with the spirits, and this is one of them. Um, let's see. I'll start with the last paragraph I read yesterday. Gary was a pranic healer, or in other words, he healed with prana. He didn't lay a hand on people, but just manipulated the vital life force around them. And like I said yesterday, people came from literally miles around Medford, Grants Pass, uh, for healings. I mean, he was a local celebrity. Okay. Uh, Gary was a pranic healer, a skill that made him somewhat a folk hero in southern Oregon. People from as far away as Grants Pass and Medford traveled to the barn to receive his treatments. Constance and I were privileged to watch him at work on a number of conditions, including asthma attacks and even broken bones. Okay, one of the first returning patients or clients of his that we did see was a boy that had broken his arm, and of course the doctor set his arm, and his arm was in a cast, and they just came to have Gary accelerate the healing process. Okay, so the boy had a cast on, and Gary sat him down, and we got to watch Gary in action. Okay, and it started off with him doing some pretty amazing breathing exercises, and when he started doing his thing, everybody in the room, it was like we were all put under kind of a spell, and it felt as though he was taking advantage of the life force in everything, not only everybody watching, but it seemed like he was using in a healthy way the life force of everything in the wood, in the walls, and everything. It seemed like the life force of that area was in this guy's uh, control. And it's just a very subjective thing, obviously. He wasn't hypnotizing us or anything. But anyway, and then he would do this thing with his hands. Okay. And it was so beautiful and so graceful and so seemingly in tune with the breath of everything in the area, okay, that you could almost see the strings of life force in red and green scintillating things. Okay, and he would build up that field around in this case, the broken bone, and it it was stunning. It's everyone in the room, they're breathing changed. There's like, well, anyway, that's a pitiful description of what went on. But anyway, Constance and I were privileged to watch him at work on a number of conditions, including asthma attacks and broken bones. However, the most amazing thing I ever saw him do was resurrect a dead cat. Now I get cynical emails about this chapter. Oh, yeah. Like most of our neighbors, the Rosignolls was their name. I call them the Dubois in this book, but I don't think they would mind anymore. Uh, were slaves to a menagerie of barnyard animals. Diane's favorites were a pair of toy poodles named Shushu and Misty. Constance and I were very impressed by the character and intelligence of these critters, and when Misty had her next litter, sired by the neighbor's dog Tootie Poo, we were the first in line for a pup, and that little sweetie was named Shep. We called him Shep, old Shep. He remained our faithful companion until his death 14 years later. He was a good dog. Diane also raised Siamese cats, who it seemed found a way to breed with every feline in southern Oregon. Predictably, the yard was alive with kittens that were just too cute for words. One summer evening, I accidentally stepped on one and crushed the poor thing to death. I was wearing my heavy work boots. I had work boots, but I didn't do much work. I was a kind of a wannabe working hippie, okay? But I did have heavy work boots. It didn't have a chance. I was hurrying to the barn, probably to see what Diane was cooking, and came down full force on the tiny fur ball. I heard it crunch with several sickening cracks that told me it was mortally injured. I dropped to my knees to see its last pitiful struggles. I had obviously broken its spine. Its back legs were completely motionless, and just for a moment it waved its front paws in the air. It was so little. Its last breath inflated its wee body like a tiny balloon, and then exited through the bloody mouth and nose, creating tiny, shiny red bubbles that quivered for an instant before popping in the warm evening air. I was so upset I couldn't think straight. I even considered going back to our cabin and not telling anyone what happened. Diane is going to kill me, I thought. I decided that I'd have to face the music sooner or later. After all, how can you lie to a psychic? Yes, Diane was painfully psychic. Okay. I picked up the little carcass. It fit easily in the palm of my hand. The black eyes were wide open and its mouth agape. I knocked on the door at the door. Diane opened it and immediately saw everything. Oh, you big oaf. Bring it in, bring it in. She snatched her dead kitten by the scruff of its neck and held it up to show Gary. Now, Gary usually could be found sitting in the lotus on their sofa. Yeah, it was only in the Himalayas and southern Oregon do you get experiences like, okay, Uh, she snatched her dead kitten by the scruff of the neck and held it up to show Gary. Its crooked body swung from her hand like a wet rag. Look what Sleeping Bear did stomping around the barnyard in the dark. Now Diane gave Indian names to nicknames to everybody that she knew. Constance was Smiling Squirrel, and I was Sleeping Bear. Look what Sleeping Bear did stomping around the barnyard in the dark. I babbled a score of groveling apologies. Gary was seated on the couch in a full lotus posture, smiling from ear to ear, wearing nothing but black Speedos. Bring it here, he said with a twinkle in his eye that I mistook for a tear. Gary, I'm sorry. It's dead. I broke its back. I crunched it with my full weight. I'm really sorry. We'll see, he said, as Diane put the kitten in his hand. Oh, God, I thought, he's going to try to bring it back to life. It might be the wrong time. Gary giggled as he began to work. He giggled. Okay, now I say giggled. It's not like he's making fun or he's making light of something. He giggled like a yogi giggles, just because they're just plugged into the pure joy of existence. Just look at the Dalai Lama when you talk to him, or when he's being interviewed, or Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. That's just how Gary was. It might be the wrong time, like that. He began to work. He held the kitten in the palm of his left hand and used his right hand to trace rings and spheres in the air around the body. His gestures and movements were intensely graceful, and as I watched him, I could almost see colored lines of energy radiating from his palms and fingertips, wrapping the little kitten in what looked like a vibrating ball of twine. After 10 minutes or so of making spherical motions, he held his hand over various parts of the kitten's body and took a series of deep breaths that he held for an impressively long time. Alternately, he emptied his lungs and held his negative breath for equally long periods. The whole atmosphere in the room became charged. My own hands and fingers tingled as I watched Gary work. Diane sat in the kitchen with her eyes closed. Now the kitchen, and indeed every room, was sort of open air. There weren't separate rooms in the barn. I was very impressed by what obviously was a psychic tour de force, but it still didn't alter the fact that the kitten was dead, really dead. And all these heroics are not going to change that. I was more than a little embarrassed for Gary. He was trying so hard to be the neighborhood holy man. And this was the first time I'd ever seen him fail in a chore. I felt extra guilty about the whole thing. He began to violently stroke the air on 4 sides of the kitten, creating, as it were, a pyramidal field. With each stroke, he raised his left hand, almost as if he were going to toss the kitten in the air. If it were alive, I thought, it would sure be getting a thrill out of that. All these rough movements jostled the little body back and forth, giving the appearance of animation. I watched Gary for nearly a half an hour. and was anxious to go home and put this sad evening behind me. I looked over at Diane, hoping to get some encouragement to leave, but her eyes were still tightly shut. Gary began the entire cycle of techniques over again. First the sphere, then the breathing, then the tossing. He repeated this cycle, this time faster, then again and again, until finally his left hand dropped to his lap. And I heard what sounded like a kitten's cough. Gary wiped a plug of brown blood from his naked leg. The kitten rolled back and forth in Gary's hand and coughed again. He turned his tiny patient on its back and began to work on its underbelly. Immediately, more brown liquid came out of its mouth. I moved closer to see. It was alive. There's no doubt about it. It was alive. Gary picked it up by the scruff of its neck and tried to get it to sit up in his hand. Its forelegs seemed willing, but it had no control of its hindquarters. "You're right," Gary giggled. They were the first words he had spoken since he began the treatment. "You broke its spine." Or his spine, as he said. Big oath. Oh, no. Big oaf. Diane chimed in without opening her eyes. Gary went to work on the back. Using his thumb and forefinger of his right hand, he rolled and twisted the air like he was rolling an invisible cigarette. He started between the kitten's ears and moved slowly down to the tip of its tail. He reminded me of a child playing doctor on a pretend patient, but it was more than pretending. As I watched his fingers move, I could clearly see what he was visualizing. I looked over to Diane. Her eyes were still closed, but she, too, shared the vision. Gary was braiding the spine in his imagination, and Diane and I were helping. For a few golden moments, I saw how everything in the universe is alive and connected to everything else. Everything is alive, and nothing is impossible if you can visualize it perfectly enough. Within a few minutes, the kitten's back legs were thrashing wildly, and Gary was having difficulty keeping the little critter in his hand. Before I went home, I watched the dead kitten sit up on the coffee table, scratch its ear with its hind legs, and yawn. In the morning, it was out in the barnyard wrestling with its brothers and sisters. Diane named it Lazarus. Later that week, Gary accidentally backed over Lazarus with a pickup truck in the barnyard. I watched him dig its shallow grave behind the chicken coop. I guess now is the right time. He giggled. Now I get grief for saying he giggled. It wasn't that kind of giggle. Anyway, that's the story. They're resurrecting the cats! Okay, I got a big day ahead of me. And I'll see you tomorrow for the Order of Monday Morning. Until then, you can read that story and many more or listen to it on audiobook, which I really enjoy listening to. It's not me, it's John Waters, not the director, but the vocal artist. He was about the age I was when I wrote that, so he's a perfect guy for the audiobook. The book's My Life with the Spirits. It's from Weiser. Uh, get another one if you've already got one. Until tomorrow, continue to be good to yourself and be good to each other. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will.